My husband is unfaithful, yet I feel nothing. My mother believes I have lost my mind. From our very first days together, I made my position clear to him. If you ever wish to cheat, simply walk away. Do not slink around in the shadows. If another woman can take you, she is welcome to keep you. He chuckled then, insisting I was his forever. That conversation took place 18 months ago. Now our neighbor, a genuine supermodel, prepares his dinner each night while I work late, and I find myself putting my own philosophy to the test. We moved into this penthouse 6 months ago. Madison appeared next door the same week. 24, Ukrainian, signed with elite model management. Her husband is 55, controls all her finances, and requires her to seek permission for groceries. I envy your renovations, she told us. Victor won't let me change a thing. He says I have no taste. My husband, Kyle, instantly offered to let her help with hours. I was working 60-hour weeks at the firm, he worked from home. It seemed logical. Initially, it was harmless. Madison would bring coffee, offer opinions on paint colors. Then she discovered Kyle adored hiking, an activity I despise, and began joining his morning trails. They would return laughing, sweaty, sharing private jokes. Then the cooking began. You work so late, she said. Kyle shouldn't eat alone. In Ukraine, we never let neighbors go hungry. Every night I came home to empty dishes from her apartment, borscht, vareniki, chicken Kiev. Somehow she had learned they were Kyle's favorites. Her husband doesn't eat with her, I asked once. Victor works late too, Moscow hours, Kyle explained. She's lonely. 2 weeks ago, I arrived home to find them splattered with paint, renovating our guest bathroom together. Madison was wearing one of Kyle's old shirts. They didn't hear me enter, too absorbed in laughter over some YouTube video. Oh, you're early, Madison exclaimed, jumping up. I'll go, you two need couple time. After she left, Kyle couldn't stop talking about how helpful she had been, her eye for design, how Victor was wasting her potential. I told my mother everything. She was furious. You're just letting this happen? Ban her from your home? If Kyle wants to cheat, that's his choice. You're insane. You're enabling this. No, I replied. I'm seeing if my husband is trustworthy. If Madison can steal him with borscht and hiking trails, he was never mine to begin with. My mother called me deranged, accused me of testing him on purpose. Perhaps I was, but I needed to know. Was Kyle the man who chose me forever, or just another man waiting for something better? Last night changed everything. I came home at midnight from a client dinner. The penthouse was dark except for candlelight from the dining room. Kyle and Madison sat at our table, wine glasses empty, her hand resting on his. They sprang apart when I walked in. It's not what it looks like, Kyle said instantly. Madison was crying. Victor hit me, I didn't know where else to go. I saw the bruise on her cheek, the cut on her lip. Why didn't you call the police? I asked. He owns me, she whispered. My visa, my modeling contract, everything is through his company. If I report him, I get deported. Kyle looked at me desperately. I told her she could stay here tonight in the guest room. I studied them both. Madison's tears seemed genuine. The bruise looked fresh, yet something felt wrong. Of course you can stay, I said. My mother called while Madison was showering. I hired a private investigator. What? You won't protect your marriage, so I will. He had been following Kyle for a week. Mother, they haven't had sex yet, but your husband goes to her apartment every day when you're at work for hours. Maybe they're just friends. The investigator has photos. They're intimate. Cuddling on her couch, her in lingerie while he's there, him zipping up her dress. My chest tightened. Send them. The photos arrived instantly. Kyle and Madison on her balcony, her in a silk robe, his arms around her waist, another of them on her couch, her head on his shoulder, his hand in her hair, one of him fastening her dress while she held her hair up. I was still staring at them when Madison emerged wearing my robe. Thank you for letting me stay. You're so kind. Kyle is lucky to have someone so understanding. Understanding? Right. I smiled. Madison, can I ask you something? How did you get that bruise exactly? She touched her cheek. Victor's ring when he backhanded me. Which hand? His right. Victor is left-handed. I've seen him sign for packages multiple times. And this happened tonight, an hour ago, but Victor's been in Moscow all week. His Instagram shows him at a conference. Madison went pale. Kyle stood up. How would you know that? He asked. I follow him. Interesting that he can abuse her from 3,000 miles away. The room fell silent. Madison's tears stopped completely. Kyle looked between us like a trapped animal. Then my phone buzzed. The private investigator, you need to see this. Just took this photo. Someone's in your apartment. The photo showed our bedroom. Through the window, a figure was going through my dresser. We were all in the living room, which meant someone else was inside. "Kyle," I said slowly, "who else has our keys?" His face lost all color. Madison's phone rang. She looked at the screen and dropped it. The caller ID said wife. But Madison didn't have a wife. I froze, my hand halfway to my own phone, watching Madison's screen glow on the dark hardwood. Wife. Kyle stepped toward the bedroom, and I grabbed his wrist hard enough to stop him. My attorney's mind took over before my emotions could. We needed evidence. We needed to secure the scene. We needed the police before whoever was in our bedroom destroyed whatever they came for. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911 with my free hand, my eyes locked on Kyle and Madison. She hadn't moved to pick up her phone. The ringing stopped and the screen went dark. Madison's tears had vanished. She stood there in my bathrobe with her arms crossed, watching me as if calculating something. Kyle tried to pull away, but I held on tighter. The dispatcher answered, and I reported an active break-in. Madison stared at her phone on the floor as if it might explode. Kyle's face shifted from confusion to pallor as he understood. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way and asked if we were in immediate danger. I said we were in the living room and the intruder was in the bedroom. She instructed us to stay put and keep the line open. Madison finally bent to retrieve her phone, but I told her to leave it. She froze halfway to the floor and looked at me. Her accent remained, but something in her eyes had changed. She straightened without touching the phone and sat on our couch. Kyle was shaking now. "What's happening?" he asked. "We're about to find out," I said. The 4 minutes until the police arrived felt like hours. No one spoke. Madison sat perfectly still. Kyle stood beside me, breathing fast. I could hear movement from the bedroom, soft sounds of someone going through drawers. Sirens finally wailed up to our building, and I buzzed the officers through the lobby. They arrived with hands on their weapons, and I pointed toward the bedroom. 2 officers moved quickly down the hall while 2 others stayed with us. We heard shouting, "Hands up, don't move, get on the ground." More officers rushed past. Madison hadn't moved from the couch. Kyle grabbed my arm. "Did you know this was going to happen?" I shook my head. I hadn't known about the intruder, but I had known something was wrong with Madison's story. An officer led a man out of our bedroom in handcuffs. He was maybe 30, dressed in black with a camera bag over his shoulder. He claimed to be building maintenance, checking a leak, but the officer held up a phone showing photos of documents. My documents, files from my home office, client contracts, financial records. The man couldn't explain why maintenance would photograph legal files at midnight. The officer sat him down on a dining chair and began questioning him. I stepped closer, studying his face. I had seen him before in the lobby. He had signed in as Madison's guest twice last week. I remembered because I noticed the same name 2 days in a row when checking the lobby logs for package deliveries. I told the officer this man had visited Madison's apartment multiple times recently. Madison went completely white, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion. Kyle turned to stare at her, his mouth open. The officer asked if I was sure, and I told him to check the building logs. Madison started to stand, but an officer asked her to remain seated. She sat back down, her whole body rigid. Another officer emerged from the bedroom holding evidence bags with my files. He asked if these were my documents, and I confirmed they were confidential client files from my law firm. The officer taking the man's statement asked Madison if she knew him. She didn't answer. Kyle asked her directly. Madison looked at the floor, her shoulders shaking without tears. The officer repeated the question. Madison finally nodded. The room went silent except for police radios crackling. I asked to see Madison's phone, and she refused, clutching it to her chest. One officer suggested she should leave since this was now a police matter and she wasn't involved. I spoke quickly. She received a very suspicious call just before we discovered the intruder. The caller ID showed wife. The officer looked at Madison and asked about the call. Madison said it was a wrong number. I pointed to her phone on the floor. The officer picked it up carefully with a gloved hand and looked at the screen. The call log showed an incoming call from a contact saved as wife. He asked Madison to explain. She clutched her chest and said it was complicated. Kyle stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, his face flushed, hands clenched into fists. The officer asked again about her relationship to the man in handcuffs. She took a long breath and admitted he was her brother-in-law, Bertram, but insisted she had no idea he was in our apartment tonight, claiming she hadn't spoken to him in weeks. The officer asked why her brother-in-law would break into her neighbor's home to photograph legal documents. Madison said she didn't know. Her story was falling apart faster than she could rebuild it. Every answer created more questions. Kyle's voice shook as he asked why she had lied about everything. She didn't respond. I called my mother while the police processed the scene. She answered on the first ring, and I told her to come now and bring Thea. She said they were already in the car and would be here in 15 minutes. The private investigator was apparently still watching our building. More officers arrived and began photographing everything, dusting for prints, bagging evidence, taking statements separately. Madison sat trapped on our couch under questioning. Kyle stood by the windows explaining to another officer how he had given Madison our door code for emergencies. I was in the kitchen recounting the evening when my mother and Thea arrived. Thea immediately began asking questions that revealed her experience with complicated cons. She wanted to know about Madison's background, her husband Victor, her modeling career, her daily routine. The detective allowed Thea to look at the photos on Bertram's phone. She scrolled through them, her face growing serious. She showed the detective something, and they spoke in low voices. Thea came over and explained that Bertram had specifically targeted documents related to my firm's client list and ongoing cases, files about 3 wealthy tech executives going through divorces. This wasn't random. Someone wanted specific information about my professional work. Madison tried to stand and leave, but officers asked her to stay for more questioning. She sat back down, and I noticed something I hadn't before. When stressed, her Ukrainian accent completely disappeared. She sounded American, born and raised in the Midwest perhaps. The officer noticed too and asked where she was originally from. Madison stumbled over her answer. Kyle finally spoke from across the room, his voice flat and defeated. He admitted Madison had told him 2 weeks ago she was actually married to a woman named Alexia, not Victor. She claimed Victor was a cover story because her modeling agency, Elite, was conservative and wouldn't accept her being gay. She needed to pretend to be straight to keep her career. Kyle had believed her. He thought he was helping her maintain a necessary lie to protect herself. He never told me because Madison begged him to keep it secret until she could figure out how to come out safely. The room went quiet again. Everyone stared at Kyle. He looked at the floor, his whole body sagging. Thea asked if Madison had ever introduced him to Alexia. Kyle shook his head. She asked if he had ever seen proof of her modeling contract. He shook his head again. She asked if he had ever actually met Victor in person. Another headshake. Thea turned to me with an expression that said everything. Madison had played my husband completely. She found his weaknesses, his need to be helpful, his desire to be trusted, his pride in being someone's confidant, and exploited everyone to gain access to our home and lives while setting up whatever this operation was. I turned to Kyle, my voice cold and flat. He opened his mouth to explain, but I held up a hand. The detective finished processing the scene and approached with his notepad. Kyle started talking fast about Madison's story of being married to Alexia, how he believed her completely, how he spent weeks helping her plan an escape from a situation that didn't exist while I worked late and trusted him. My chest felt tight, but my face remained blank. The detective asked when Madison first told him about Alexia. Kyle said it was 2 weeks ago during a morning hike. She cried on the trail and he comforted her. The detective wrote this down and asked if Kyle had ever met Alexia or seen proof of the modeling contract. Kyle shook his head twice. The detective asked if he had ever met Victor in person. Another headshake. I watched Kyle realize how completely he had been played. His face paled, and he sat down hard on our couch. Madison still sat across from us, hands folded in her lap. Her accent was completely gone now. She sounded American, from the Midwest perhaps. The detective noticed and asked where she was originally from. She stumbled and said, "Ukraine," but it sounded like a question. No one believed her. Thea touched my elbow and guided me toward the kitchen. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through more photos from yesterday afternoon. Madison at a coffee shop. With 2 other people, a woman around 30 with dark hair pulled back and a man who looked similar. They had papers spread across the table. Thea zoomed in. I could see building floor plans, security schedules, lists of names. My name was on one list. Thea swiped to another photo showing Madison pointing at something on the floor plan. The woman was taking notes. The man was on his phone. Thea said they met for over an hour and left separately. Her partner, Holden, followed Madison back to the building while Thea followed the other two to a hotel. This wasn't random. It was planned and coordinated. Madison had help, and they had targeted our building specifically. I looked back at the living room where Madison sat with the officers. She looked small and scared, but I knew now it was all performance. A new detective arrived, older with gray hair and sharp eyes. He walked in, introduced himself without shaking hands, assessed the scene, then turned to me and asked what I did for work. I told him I was an attorney at a corporate firm downtown, mostly handling high-asset divorces and business disputes. He asked if any of my current clients were particularly wealthy or had sensitive information. My stomach dropped. 3 names jumped out immediately: tech executives going through complicated divorces. They had given me extensive financial discovery documents, bank records, business valuations, investment portfolios, asset lists, everything someone would need for identity theft or corporate espionage. I kept copies in my home office because I worked late there several nights a week. The detective saw my face change and asked what I was thinking. I told him about the 3 clients and their documents. He asked where I kept the files. I pointed toward my home office down the hall. He called over the forensic technician, and they headed that way together. I followed them to my office. My desk was neat as I had left it, but my laptop was open. I always closed it when done working. The technician checked the browser history and found searches I hadn't made: my clients' names, their companies, their spouses, divorce settlement amounts. Someone had sat at my desk and researched everything. The detective asked if anyone else had access to this room. I shook my head, then stopped. Kyle was home alone several times when Madison visited. She could have come in here while he was in another room, or maybe he let her in. Maybe he showed her everything, thinking he was helping her understand business. I felt sick. The detective asked if I password protected my files. I said yes, but my laptop auto-logged in when opened, basic security that suddenly seemed incredibly stupid. The technician found more evidence. My desk drawer had been opened, files removed, everything gone through carefully and put back almost perfectly. Almost. The detective asked Kyle to come to the office. Kyle walked in looking miserable. The detective asked if Madison was ever alone in this room. Kyle said yes, she was in the apartment alone a few times when he ran errands. He had given her our door code 3 weeks ago in case of emergencies. The detective wrote this down, his expression showing what he thought of that decision. Madison was still in the living room. When the detective returned, he sat across from her and started asking questions calmly but firmly about Alexia and Bertram. Madison's face crumbled, and she began crying again. The detective waited. Madison said Alexia was her wife and Bertram was Alexia's brother. She admitted Alexia sent Bertram to get the documents tonight, insisting she didn't know the plan until this evening. She said Alexia became obsessed with making a big score, and Madison was just trying to keep her happy. The detective asked why Madison moved into this building. Madison said it was Alexia's idea. The detective asked about Victor. Madison admitted Victor never existed. The Instagram account was fake. The abusive husband story was fake, everything designed to gain sympathy and access. The detective asked about the bruise on her face. Madison touched her cheek and said she did it herself with makeup. The cut on her lip was real, but she did it on purpose. The detective asked how many other residents she targeted. Madison said she didn't know. Alexia handled the planning. Madison just did what she was told. The detective didn't look like he believed her. Kyle stood in the doorway listening, his face destroyed. He had believed every word, thought he was helping someone escape abuse. He had given her our security code and access to our home, let her into our lives completely. The detective asked if Kyle ever suspected Madison was lying. Kyle said no. She seemed genuinely scared and desperate. The detective asked if they were physically intimate. Kyle said no loudly. They were just friends, he was helping her. The detective asked if they spent time alone together frequently. Kyle admitted they did, morning hikes, afternoon. On renovation work, evening dinners when I worked late, hours and hours over 6 months. The detective wrote everything down. Kyle looked at me desperately, but I looked away. I couldn't deal with his guilt now. My professional reputation was about to explode because my husband gave a con artist access to confidential client files. Everything I built was at risk because I trusted Kyle and he trusted Madison. The detective stood and made a phone call, speaking quietly about arresting Bertram and detaining Madison. Officers moved to take Bertram into custody. He didn't resist. They read him his rights and cuffed him. The detective told Madison she was being detained for questioning as a potential accomplice. She started crying harder, saying she didn't know. The detective said they'd sort it out at the station. Officers helped her stand and walked her toward the door. She looked back at Kyle, and her expression shifted for just a second, not scared or sad, but calculating, as if measuring whether he would still defend her. Then the mask dropped back, and she was crying again. They took her out, and the apartment suddenly felt very empty. Just me, Kyle, my mother, and Thea standing in our violated home. The forensic technician was still processing my office. Other officers finished their reports, but the main action was over. I pulled out my phone. It was 2:00 a.m. I needed to call my firm's senior partner and report a potential client confidentiality breach. My hands shook as I found his number. He answered after 4 rings, sounding groggy. I apologized and explained everything as clearly as I could. Intruder, documents photographed, laptop accessed, client information compromised, my personal life creating professional liability. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked which clients. I told him the 3 names. He was quiet again. I could hear the disappointment in his silence. He asked if the police recovered the photos. I said yes. He asked if any information was transmitted or sold. I said I didn't know yet. He told me to come to the office first thing in the morning. We'd need to notify the clients and assess the damage. He said we'd figure it out, but his tone said my partnership track had just derailed. He hung up and I stood in my kitchen holding my phone. My mother watched me with sad eyes. Thea spoke quietly to the detective. Kyle sat on the couch with his head in his hands. The detective finished with the officers and came over. He said Bertram was being charged with burglary and attempted theft of confidential documents. Madison was being held for questioning, and they determined charges based on what they learned. I should expect follow-up questions over the next few days. He handed me his card and left with the remaining officers. The forensic technician finished in my office, packed up, and told me not to use my laptop until their tech team examined it. He left too. Then it was just the 4 of us. The silence was crushing. My mother went to the kitchen and started making tea, as if that would fix anything. The kettle whistled. She poured 4 cups. We sat around our dining table where Kyle and Madison had sat with wine just hours ago, candles burned down to nothing. Thea broke the silence, explaining what she and Holden had discovered. They had been tracking Madison for 3 days since my mother hired them. They suspected something larger than a simple affair when they saw her movement patterns. She met with the same 2 people multiple times, spent hours studying our building's layout, asked other residents about security and schedules. Thea said Madison had been in the building exactly 6 months. Thea checked with building management and found reports of small thefts and security breaches over that same period. A resident's credit card information stolen, another's identity used to open accounts, building access codes mysteriously changing. Madison wasn't just targeting us. She was working the entire building as part of a larger operation. Thea showed me her investigation file with photos, timelines, and notes, extensive and professional. My mother had hired good people. Thea said they couldn't prove anything until tonight when Bertram made his move. Now the police had everything they needed. I walked into my home office with Thea following. My laptop sat on my desk innocently. Thea pulled on gloves, opened the browser history, and my stomach dropped as I saw the searches. My client names, their business holdings, divorce settlement amounts, property valuations, bank account details. Someone had gone through everything systematically while I was at work. Thea scrolled through timestamps. They matched perfectly with days Kyle admitted Madison was here alone. She took screenshots while I stood there feeling sick. Kyle appeared in the doorway. I turned to face him. He looked at the screen and went pale. I asked him directly how many times Madison was in this apartment without him PR. Essent, he stammered that maybe 3 or 4 times when he ran to the store or picked up takeout. Never more than 30 minutes, he swore. Thea showed him the browser history timestamps. Some sessions lasted over an hour. Kyle's face crumbled as he realized Madison had lied about staying in the living room. She had told him she was watching TV or checking her phone, but instead she was in here stealing my clients' confidential information. Rage built inside me, but I kept my voice steady as I asked what else he had let her do unsupervised. He insisted nothing else, just those few times he thought she was trustworthy. I laughed, the sound bitter even to my own ears. Thea bagged my laptop as evidence, saying the forensic team would do a full analysis. She asked if I kept any client files in physical form here. I showed her the filing cabinet. She photographed everything before we went through each folder. Nothing appeared physically missing, but that meant nothing if Madison had photographed documents with her phone. We spent 2 hours cataloging every file, every piece of paper, every note. My mother brought coffee at some point, but I barely tasted it. The sun came up, I hadn't slept. I showered and put on my best suit-like armor. The drive downtown felt surreal. My firm occupied floors 12 through 15 of a glass tower. I had worked here for 7 years, built my reputation case by case. Now I walked into the senior partner's conference room to explain how I had compromised everything. 3 partners sat at the table with our cybersecurity director. Their faces were professional, but I could read the disappointment. I laid out what happened as clinically as possible. The neighbor who gained access, the break-in, the laptop history showing unauthorized searches. They asked questions, and I answered each one honestly. How long did this person have access? Did I ever discuss clients by name at home? Were any physical documents photographed? The cybersecurity director took notes and said they'd need my laptop for a full forensic audit. He asked about my backup systems and cloud storage. I told him everything was password protected, but Madison had access to my apartment for months. She could have watched me type passwords, installed keyloggers, done anything. The senior partner who recruited me 7 years ago looked tired. He said they'd need to notify all affected clients about the potential breach. My partnership track, supposed to happen next year, suddenly felt very far away. They were professional. No yelling, no accusations, just quiet disappointment that somehow felt worse. They told me to take the rest of the day to get my personal affairs in order. We'd reconvene tomorrow to discuss next steps. I left the conference room. Several colleagues turned away rather than make eye contact. My reputation was crumbling in real time. Kyle was sitting in our living room when I got home. He stood up when I walked in and started talking, saying he was so sorry, he never meant for any of this to happen. Madison seemed so genuine. I held up my hand and cut him off. My voice was calm but cold when I told him to pack a bag and stay at a hotel while I figured out what came next. He protested that nothing physical happened with Madison. I laughed harshly. I told him I didn't care if he touched her or not. He had let her into our home, our lives, my office. He gave her access to everything and kept secrets for weeks. The physical affair didn't matter because the betrayal of trust was already complete. He started crying, saying he'd do anything to fix this. I told him the only thing he could do right now was leave. He asked for how long. I said I didn't know, maybe a week, maybe forever. He needed to let me think without him here reminding me of how stupid I was. He went to pack. I sat on the couch staring at nothing. My mother called, but I didn't answer. 20 minutes later, Kyle came out with a suitcase. He tried one more time to apologize, and I just pointed at the door. After he left, I changed all the locks using my phone app, changed the security code, changed the elevator access, erased him from the building systems entirely. It took 10 minutes to undo 18 months of shared life. My phone rang. It was Mia from the firm. She asked if I needed company, and I said yes before I could think better of it. She arrived 30 minutes later with her laptop and a box of file folders. Mia had been my friend for 5 years, since she started as a junior associate. She didn't ask questions about Kyle or Madison, just sat up at my dining room table and started helping me organize evidence for the firm's internal investigation. We created a timeline of every interaction I could remember. Every time Madison was in the apartment, every conversation, every moment that seemed innocent but now looked suspicious. Mia took notes in her precise handwriting, asking clarifying questions that helped me remember details I'd forgotten. The time Madison asked about my morning routine, the day she wanted to know which clients kept me working late, the casual questions about building security. Everything that seemed like friendly interest was actually intelligence gathering. We worked for hours building a comprehensive document. Mia photographed everything Thea collected earlier. We cross-referenced timestamps from the building's guest log with my work calendar to show when Madison had unsupervised access. By evening, we had a file that would make any prosecutor proud. Mia closed her laptop and finally asked if I was okay. I told her honestly that I didn't know. She hugged me and said the firm would get through this, and so would I. The detective called while Mia was packing up. He said they'd identified Madison, and I should sit down for this. Her real name was Madison Volkov, and she was wanted in 2 other states for similar operations. She had targeted a doctor in Boston last year, got access to his home under similar pretenses, stole patient records, and sold them for identity theft. Before that, she worked over a venture capitalist in Seattle, same pattern of befriending the target, gaining access, stealing confidential business information. The detective said Alexia Cobb was Madison's wife and partner in these schemes. They'd been running cons at least 3 years that law enforcement knew about, probably longer. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like an idiot who fell for the oldest trick in the book. The detective said he'd be in touch as the investigation continued and told me to be careful because Alexia was still at large and these people could be dangerous when cornered. I thanked him and hung up. Mia stared at me with wide eyes. I told her what the detective said, and she looked sick. She said she was staying the night, and I didn't argue. The next morning, I was drinking coffee when my phone buzzed with an email from the detective containing a full report on Madison's criminal history. I opened it and started reading. Victor never existed. The Instagram account was completely fake, stock photos stolen from a Russian businessman's social media. The conference photos were pulled from public corporate websites. The entire abused wife story was manufactured to gain sympathy and access. Every tear was calculated, every bruise was makeup, every scared glance was practiced. I scrolled through the evidence and felt stupid for believing any of it. The report showed Madison's modeling credentials were also fake. She never worked for elite models, never had any legitimate modeling career. That whole identity was constructed specifically for this building and this operation. I thought about how she played me, how she found my weakness, my philosophy about trust, and exploited it perfectly, how she used Kyle's kindness and loneliness against him, how every single interaction was a manipulation. Mia came out of the guest room and found me crying at the kitchen table. She read over my shoulder and swore quietly. She made more coffee, and we sat together in silence. Thea called around noon and asked if she could come over with Holden. I said yes, and they arrived with a thick file folder. Thea spread photos across my dining table. Madison meeting with Alexia at a coffee shop 3 blocks away, the 2 of them with Bertram outside our building, studying the entrance. More photos of them in a car, reviewing what looked like building security footage on a laptop. Holden explained they'd been tracking Madison since my mother hired them. They suspected something larger than a simple affair when they noticed her movement patterns. She met with the same 2 people repeatedly, spent hours studying our building's layout, asked other residents questions about security protocols and delivery schedules. Thea pointed to a photo of Madison and Alexia reviewing documents. She said they had somehow accessed building security footage, probably through Bertram, who worked as maintenance in another property owned by the same company. They studied resident schedules, identified targets, planned entry strategies. Our apartment wasn't random. We were selected specifically because of my career and client list. Holden showed me more photos of Bertram entering our building wearing maintenance uniforms on 3 separate occasions over the past month. He had been inside before the night we caught him. Thea said they had evidence of Madison casing at least 5 other apartments in the building. We were just one of multiple active operations. I met with building management the next afternoon. The property manager looked uncomfortable as she pulled up Madison's lease file. She confirmed the lease was paid for 6 months upfront in cash by a shell company registered in Delaware. The background check came back clean, but now they were discovering it was completely falsified. Fake employment verification, fake references, fake credit history, everything designed to pee. As a standard screening. The property manager said they were implementing new protocols after this, more thorough background checks, verification calls to previous landlords, credit checks through multiple agencies. She apologized repeatedly, but it didn't change what happened. I asked about the other residents Madison targeted. The property manager said they were still investigating, but at least 2 other apartments reported suspicious activity. One resident had credit card information stolen, another had their identity used to open fraudulent accounts. Madison and her crew were working the entire building as a criminal enterprise. I asked why nobody noticed sooner. The property manager admitted they had reports of security breaches, but attributed them to normal urban crime. Nobody connected the pattern until now. I left the meeting feeling angry at everyone, including myself. The firm's legal team scheduled depositions for the following week. I sat in a conference room with 3 attorneys while they assessed liability and potential malpractice claims. They asked the same questions over and over. When did I first meet Madison? How often was she in my home? Did I ever discuss clients by name? Were any documents left accessible? Did I have proper security protocols? I answered everything honestly, even though each question felt like an accusation. 3 clients had already contacted the firm demanding answers. One was threatening to sue both me personally and the firm for negligence. Another wanted to know exactly what information was compromised and how it would be secured. The third was simply furious that I brought work home and failed to protect confidential files properly. The legal team explained they were trying to get ahead of potential lawsuits and bar complaints. They needed comprehensive documentation of everything that happened. I spent 6 hours going through every detail while they took notes and recorded everything. By the end, I felt hollowed out. My career, built so carefully, was hanging by a thread because I trusted the wrong person and married someone with terrible judgment. Kyle kept calling, but I sent every call to voicemail. He left long messages apologizing and begging to talk. I deleted them without listening all the way through. We communicated only by text about practical matters. He asked about his belongings. I told him to coordinate with building management for a time when I wasn't home. He asked about bills. I forwarded him his half. He asked if we could try counseling. I didn't respond. My mother called every day wanting me to file for divorce immediately. She said Kyle enabled everything and didn't deserve another chance. I told her I couldn't make that decision yet while drowning in depositions, client meetings, and damage control. She argued that waiting just prolonged the pain, but I needed time to process everything else before handling ending my marriage. Kyle texted asking if there was any hope for us. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back that I didn't know. He responded immediately asking what he could do. I told him the truth. Nothing he did now changed what he already did. The trust was gone, and I didn't know if it could be rebuilt. He texted back saying he'd wait as long as it took. I didn't respond because I didn't know what to say. The detective called 3 days later to tell me they had executed a warrant on Madison's apartment. I met him at the police station, where he spread evidence photos across a conference table. Surveillance cameras hidden in picture frames, a laptop with software for monitoring wireless networks, fake passports showing Madison's face with 5 different names, driver's licenses from 3 states, a filing system with tabs for 6 different building residents, including detailed notes about our schedules, jobs, visitors. My file was the thickest, notes about my late work hours, client names she must have overheard through walls or windows, photographs of me leaving for the office with timestamps, Kyle's daily routine mapped out in careful handwriting. The detective pointed to another folder labeled with a couple's name from the 4th floor, same level of detail, same calculated surveillance. We weren't special or chosen. We were just one target in a larger operation running simultaneously throughout the building. The detective showed me printed emails between Madison and Alexia discussing which residents had the most valuable access. My name appeared frequently because of my client list. High-worth divorces meant financial records and asset information. Madison specifically requested assignment to me after researching my firm online and identifying me as worth the effort. Every conversation about hiking was planned. Every cooking session was strategy. She learned Kyle loved those specific Ukrainian dishes by going through our trash and finding takeout containers, then researched the recipes. The detective led me through a timeline they built from Madison's notes. She identified my work schedule within the first week, learned Kyle worked from home within 2 weeks, started the coffee and paint color conversations once she confirmed I left early and returned late, engineered the hiking discovery by following Kyle one morning and pretending it was coincidence. The whole friendship was constructed step by careful step based on surveillance and research. Nothing was real, nothing was accident. I sat in that conference room, staring at evidence of my own stupidity, and felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with Kyle or marriage or philosophy. Mia came to my apartment that weekend with her laptop and a legal pad. We needed to prepare for client meetings where I had to disclose the security breach and explain how confidential information was potentially compromised. She helped me draft disclosure letters that were honest without being alarmist. We practiced what I'd say when clients asked how this happened, how I'd explain that I brought work home and failed to secure it properly, how I'd take responsibility without making excuses. The first meeting was Monday morning, with a tech executive going through a complicated divorce involving stock options and intellectual property. I sat across from him in a conference room and watched his face change as I explained. He was angry but controlled, asking detailed questions about what specific documents were in my home office, whether his financial statements were photographed, what security measures the firm was implementing. I answered everything honestly and offered to step away from his case if he wanted different representation. He thought for a long moment, then said he appreciated my honesty, but this was unacceptable and he'd be discussing it with the senior partners. The second meeting went similarly. A woman whose husband was hiding assets offshore. She was understanding but furious that her private financial information was accessible to criminals. She said she trusted me to protect her interests, and I failed that basic responsibility. I didn't argue because she was right. The third client threatened to sue both me and the firm for negligence and breach of fiduciary duty, saying his case involved sensitive business information that could damage his company if it got out. His attorney was already drafting a complaint. I sat through his anger without defending myself because there was no defense that mattered. The detective called again Tuesday afternoon. Alexia and 2 other accomplices had disappeared. Madison's phone records showed she made 3 calls in the 20 minutes between when I confronted her about Victor and when the police arrived. Alexia got enough warning to run. They were tracking financial records and communications, but the operation was sophisticated: multiple shell companies, Bitcoin transactions, encrypted messaging apps. Alexia might have already left the country with fake documents like the ones they found in Madison's apartment. The detective said they were working with federal agencies now because the scope crossed state lines and involved identity fraud, but he was honest that people this organized usually had escape plans. Madison stayed behind either because she was genuinely surprised or because she was the expendable one. Either way, the main architect was gone. I moved through the next 2 weeks barely sleeping. Depositions with the firm's legal team, client meetings where I explained and apologized, damage control sessions with senior partners, security consultations about what went wrong and how to prevent it happening again. I came home each night to the penthouse that didn't feel safe anymore, the living room where Madison sat crying with her fake bruise, the kitchen where she cooked all those calculated meals, the guest bathroom where she and Kyle laughed over paint colors while planning God knows what. Every room held evidence of how thoroughly I was deceived, while I convinced myself I was enlightened and non-controlling. My philosophy about trust and autonomy felt naive now. I let Madison into my home repeatedly, watched Kyle spend hours with her, and told myself I was being mature and secure. I brought confidential client files home and left them accessible because I never imagined my neighbor was a professional con artist. The deception wasn't just that Madison lied. It was that I created the perfect conditions for the lies to work. Kyle showed up at my office Thursday morning without warning. Building security called to ask if I'd see him, and I almost said no, but I needed to face this eventually, so I told them to send him up. He looked terrible when he walked in, unshaven for days, lost weight visible in his face and the way his shirt hung, dark circles under his eyes. He sat across from my desk, and I felt nothing except tired anger, not at him specifically, but at both of us for being so easy to manipulate. I agreed to meet him for coffee at a neutral location that afternoon. We sat in a corner booth at a place neither of us had been before. He started apologizing immediately, and I cut him off because I didn't want apologies. I wanted to understand how he let this happen, how we both let this happen. He cried while explaining that Madison told him elaborate stories about escaping abuse and finding herself, about how Victor controlled everything and she felt trapped, about how talking to Kyle made her feel like maybe she could have a real life someday. He genuinely believed he was helping someone in crisis, thought he was being supportive and kind, never intended for it to become what it became. I pointed out that he chose to believe her lies and keep secrets from me, that he spent hours alone with her every day and never once thought maybe he should tell his wife about the depth of their friendship, that he gave her our security code without asking me, that every choice he made enabled everything that followed. He argued he was just trying to be a good person. I told him good people don't keep secrets from their spouses. Good people don't let someone else become more important than their marriage. He insisted nothing physical happened, and I laughed because that wasn't the point. The point was he chose her over me every single day for months, chose to believe her stories over maintaining boundaries with me, chose to help her instead of protecting what we built together. I told him my philosophy about cheating was naive and incomplete. I never accounted for emotional betrayal, for someone letting another person become more important than their spouse without ever touching them, for the way secrets corrode trust even when nothing physical happens. I thought I was being mature by not being jealous or controlling, but really I was just giving him permission to prioritize someone else while I worked late and convinced myself I was enlightened. He argued he was just being kind and Madison needed help. I told him kindness doesn't require secrecy and daily intimacy. Kindness doesn't mean spending hours alone with someone while hiding the depth of your friendship from your spouse. Kindness doesn't mean giving someone your home security code without discussing it with the person you live with. He had no response to that. We sat in silence while our coffee got cold. The senior partners called me in Friday for a meeting about my future with the company. I walked in expecting another round of professional consequences, but their faces weren't angry. The managing partner gestured to a chair and slid a folder across the table. Inside was my performance review for the probationary period, filled with notes about my work on the smaller cases they assigned me, my handling of client communications, my cooperation with the internal investigation. They acknowledged that I worked harder than anyone expected during the worst months of my career, that I rebuilt client trust one case at a time, that I never complained about the demotion or made excuses for what happened. The managing partner told me they were offering me a path back to significant cases starting next month, though partnership was delayed by at least 2 years while I continued proving my judgment and reliability. I accepted without hesitation because I understood that trust, once broken, requires years to rebuild, and I was lucky they were giving me the chance at all. Mia got promoted to partner 2 months later, and I attended the ceremony without jealousy or resentment. She worked for it and earned it. When she gave her acceptance speech, she mentioned how much she learned from working with me during the crisis, how I showed her what professional integrity looks like even when everything is falling apart. Several colleagues who avoided me for months started nodding as she spoke. I realized her generosity was helping repair my reputation in ways I couldn't do alone. After the ceremony, she hugged me and whispered that she had recommended me for 2 of her overflow cases, high-value clients who specifically requested someone with experience handling complex personal situations. The work started flowing back gradually, not the flood of cases I had before, but steady referrals from people who respected how I handled disaster with honesty instead of deflection. 6 months after the break-in, I signed the lease on a smaller apartment in a neighborhood across town. The building had better security, key card access for every floor, cameras in all common areas, a doorman who actually checked identification. My mother helped me move in and spent an entire weekend arranging furniture and hanging curtains, chattering about color schemes and natural light without mentioning Kyle's name once. She brought takeout for dinner, and we ate sitting on boxes in the living room. She told me the apartment felt like a fresh start, a place where I could build something new. Without ghosts watching from every corner. I slept better the first night there than I had in months. No memories of Madison's fake tears or Kyle's betrayal embedded in the walls. I ran into Kyle 3 weeks later at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. He was waiting for his order when I walked in. We both froze for a second before he smiled tentatively and asked how I was doing. We ended up sitting at a corner table for 20 minutes having the most genuinely friendly conversation we'd had since everything exploded. He told me he'd been dating someone from his therapy group, a woman who survived her own manipulation and understood why he fell for Madison's act. He looked lighter somehow, less burdened by guilt, and I realized I felt nothing except mild curiosity about his happiness. There was no anger left, no lingering attachment, just two people who used to be married comparing notes on their separate lives. He asked if I was seeing anyone, and I told him, not yet, but maybe soon. He nodded as if he understood that I needed time to figure out who I am without him or the marriage we built. Thea and Holden became unexpected friends over the following months. They invited me to dinner occasionally to share updates on other cases they were working, and Thea told me that exposing Madison and Alexia's operation helped break up a larger network of similar cons targeting professionals in major cities. The FBI connected their scheme to at least 12 other victims across 6 states, all following the same pattern of manufactured vulnerability and strategic access to confidential information. Holden showed me surveillance photos from a case in Chicago where they caught another team using identical tactics. Knowing my disaster helped protect other people made the whole nightmare feel slightly less pointless. We toasted to small victories, and they told me I was stronger than most people they'd worked with, that most victims of elaborate cons never recover their professional standing the way I was rebuilding mine. A colleague from another firm contacted me about a pro bono case 8 months after everything fell apart. Another attorney had been targeted by a different con artist who used a fake emergency to gain access to her client files, and she was facing ethics complaints and potential disbarment while trying to prove she was manipulated rather than negligent. I met with her at a neutral location and recognized the shame in her eyes, the desperate need to make someone understand that she wasn't stupid or careless, just human. I spent 3 hours walking her through everything I learned about documenting the manipulation, gathering evidence of the con artist's pattern, demonstrating to ethics boards that reasonable precautions failed against sophisticated deception. Turning my disaster into something useful for others felt like meaningful progress, like finding purpose in the wreckage. A year after that night when everything unraveled, I was sitting in my apartment reviewing case files and realized I was genuinely happy. Not the naive happiness I had before when I thought my philosophy about trust made me enlightened, but authentic satisfaction with the life I'd rebuilt from nothing. My apartment was smaller, but it was mine, decorated with furniture I chose without compromise. My partnership was delayed, but my client list was growing again with referrals from people who respected how I handled crisis with integrity. My philosophy about trust had evolved from idealistic nonsense to realistic wisdom about human nature, about the importance of verification alongside faith, about the difference between trusting blindly and trusting wisely. I wasn't the same person who moved into that penthouse 18 months ago, and I was grateful for that because she was setting herself up for exactly what happened. My mother and I had dinner every Sunday now, and our relationship was stronger than it had ever been. She never said, "I told you so," about Kyle or Madison, never gloated about being right when I was wrong, just sat across from me each week sharing updates about her book club and asking about my cases. Sometimes I caught her looking at me with quiet satisfaction, not because I suffered, but because I survived and grew from the experience. She told me once that she was proud of how I handled everything, how I took responsibility instead of making excuses, how I rebuilt instead of running away. Coming from her, someone who rarely gave compliments, it meant more than any professional achievement. I started dating again casually, meeting people through friends and work connections, approaching new relationships with updated boundaries that balanced openness with appropriate caution. My philosophy about trust had evolved from the naive idealism I started with to realistic wisdom about human nature. I still believed in giving people chances, but now I verified instead of just trusting. I watched for patterns instead of ignoring red flags, I protected my professional life instead of letting personal relationships compromise it. The men I dated now got honesty about what happened and what I learned. The ones who couldn't handle my wariness didn't get second dates. I wasn't interested in proving I was healed by rushing into something new, just slowly building connections with people who understood that wisdom sometimes comes from disaster. The firm officially restored me to full standing 18 months after the break-in. The managing partner called me into his office and told me they were assigning me a major case representing a tech executive in a complex divorce with millions in assets and complicated business holdings. My first instinct was anxiety about the parallels to what happened, handling confidential information for wealthy clients after my security was compromised. But then I realized I was uniquely qualified for this case precisely because I understood the stakes and vulnerabilities, because I knew how con artists target professionals with access to valuable information, because I could protect this client in ways other attorneys might miss. I accepted the case and spent the first week implementing security protocols that went beyond standard practice, protecting client data like I should have protected my own. The case went to trial 8 months later, and I was ready in ways I never was before. Every document was organized, every witness prepared, every angle covered 3 times over. My client trusted me completely because I had been honest about what happened and what I learned. That honesty built something stronger than the blind faith I used to offer. The opposing counsel tried to paint my past security breach as evidence of incompetence, but I addressed it directly in my opening statement, explaining how surviving professional crisis taught me to protect clients better than attorneys who never faced consequences for their mistakes. The jury responded to that authenticity, and over 6 days of testimony, I dismantled the opposing side's arguments with precision that came from rebuilding my skills from the ground up. When the verdict came back in our favor with a settlement that exceeded our initial demands, my client hugged me in the courthouse hallway and told 3 of his business partners about my work before we even left the building. Those referrals turned into 3 major cases over the next 4 months, all high-profile tech executives with complex asset divisions and confidential business holdings. The firm's senior partners noticed. They called me into a meeting and restored my partnership track to the original timeline, acknowledging that I had not only recovered from the crisis, but emerged as someone uniquely qualified for sensitive cases requiring both legal expertise and hard-won wisdom about security and trust. 2 years after that night, when Madison's phone showed a caller ID that unraveled everything, I sat in my smaller apartment reviewing case files for tomorrow's client meeting and felt something unexpected settle in my chest. Genuine contentment, not the forced optimism I performed for months while rebuilding, but real satisfaction with who I had become through disaster and recovery. My marriage to Kyle ended in an uncontested divorce that felt more like a business dissolution than the death of love, and I understood now that what we had was built on my naive philosophy about trust rather than actual intimacy or partnership. Madison and Alexia were both serving prison sentences for their coordinated cons, and while that justice felt meaningful, it didn't define my story anymore. My career took damage that required 2 years of relentless work to repair, but the attorney I am now understands vulnerabilities and human nature in ways my younger self never could. And that expertise makes me better at protecting clients who trust me with their most sensitive information. I learned that surviving betrayal with integrity matters more than never being betrayed at all. That wisdom sometimes requires disaster as tuition, and that my philosophy about trust needed updating from idealistic theory to realistic practice that verifies while still believing in human goodness. The case files spread across my coffee table represented clients who chose me specifically because of what I survived and how I handled it, and that validation felt more solid than any achievement I earned when success came easily. The life I have now is not the one I imagined, but it is one I've chosen, piece by piece, in the wake of the wreckage. The world I built with Kyle, a world I thought was built on mutual respect and a sophisticated, unshakable trust, was a beautiful, fragile fiction. In the end, it collapsed under the weight of a single, meticulously crafted lie. But from that collapse, I've gathered the raw materials to build something sturdier, something that acknowledges both the good in people and their cap. A city for deception. My days have a new rhythm. The frantic, late-night scrambles for the partnership that felt like my entire identity have been replaced by a steadier, more deliberate pace. I work hard, but I also leave the office. I have dinners with my mother, drinks with Mia, and the occasional awkward but well-intentioned setup from Thea. My calendar holds client meetings, court dates, and now, therapy appointments. I no longer see the therapist weekly, but I check in monthly, a preventative maintenance for my judgment and my boundaries. The apartment is a sanctuary of my own design. No shared history whispers from the walls. Every book on the shelf, every print on the wall, every piece of mismatched china in the cupboard is mine alone, chosen because I liked it, not because it fit a shared aesthetic or a fantasy of a future that would never arrive. There is a peace in the solitude that I never would have understood before. It's not loneliness, it's ownership. Professionally, the shadow of the breach is long, but it no longer darkens every room. The senior partners, while still cautious, have begun to treat me not as a liability in recovery, but as an asset with unique, hard-won insight. I've become the person they assign to clients who are paranoid about security, who have been burned before, who need more than just legal expertise. They need someone who understands how trust can be weaponized. I don't shy away from my history with these clients. I explain it succinctly, a 3-sentence summary of a 2-year nightmare. I was the target of a professional con that compromised client data. I rebuilt my protocols from the ground up. What I learned makes me uniquely vigilant in protecting your interests. Their nods are not of pity, but of recognition. They want someone who has been through the fire. Kyle and I have settled into a distant, formal cordiality. Our communication is limited to the necessary exchanges regarding the final sale of the penthouse and the division of the last joint assets. The emails are signed with our full names. There is a strange, sterile closure to it. The love we had, or the idea of love we nurtured, has been completely metabolized into lessons learned and mistakes accounted for. I hear through mutual acquaintances that he is still with the woman from his therapy group, that they are talking about moving in together. I feel a flicker of something, not jealousy, perhaps a mild curiosity, and then it passes. His life is no longer a thread in the tapestry of mine. My mother remains my anchor. Our Sunday dinners are a ritual I protect fiercely. Over pasta, she will sometimes carefully circle back to the past, not to Kyle, but to her own feelings during that time. "I was so afraid for you," she said recently, pushing her plate aside. Not just of what they were doing, but of what you were doing to yourself, holding so tightly to that idea of being above jealousy that you were letting someone walk right in and take what was yours. I didn't argue. I just reached over and squeezed her hand. Her interference, which felt like an insult to my intelligence and autonomy, was the ultimate act of love. She saw the cliff I was walking toward, and she threw a rope, even when I was yelling at her to stop. Madison and Alexia's world has continued to unravel from within the prison system. The detective keeps me updated, though the emails are less frequent now. Alexia's appeals have been denied. Madison, in a bid for a reduced sentence, has provided testimony that has led to the dismantling of 2 other small-time fraud rings. They are both becoming case studies, their methods cataloged in law enforcement databases. They are figures in a file now, not phantoms in my home. The visceral fear their names once evoked has dulled into an academic interest. I read the updates not with panic, but with the detached focus of a professional studying a familiar strain of virus. The most unexpected development has been the quiet sense of purpose that has grown from the ashes. Mia and I have started a casual, informal mentorship program at the firm for junior associates, focusing not just on legal strategy, but on professional security and personal boundaries. We talk about the blurry line between being a team player and being exploited, about the importance of securing confidential information in an age of remote work, about listening to your gut when a client or a colleague feels off. I tell my story, not as a cautionary tale of victimhood, but as a case study in flawed assumptions. The associates listen, their young faces serious. I see in their eyes the same conviction I once had, that being smart and principled is a shield against deception. I hope to give them a better shield. I have been on a handful of dates. A venture capitalist who talked only about his portfolio, a professor of literature who sent beautiful, rambling texts but never asked a single question about me, a chef who was kind and funny but whose life was a whirlwind of 3 a.m. bedtimes and chaotic passion that left me exhausted. None have stuck, and that's okay. For the first time in my adult life, I am not measuring a relationship against the ticking clock of marriage or partnership. I am measuring it against a simpler metric. Does this person add peace or subtract it? Does their presence in my life feel like a choice or an obligation? The answers have been clear, and I have acted on them without guilt. Tonight, as I finish reviewing a deposition transcript, my phone lights up with a calendar reminder for tomorrow. Lunch, David. David is an architect I met at a fundraiser Mia dragged me to. Our first coffee was surprisingly easy. He asked thoughtful questions, listened to the answers, and shared stories of his own professional disasters with a wry humor that didn't feel like a performance. He didn't flinch when I gave him my standard, abbreviated con artist neighbor summary. He just nodded and said, "That sounds unimaginably stressful. It must have changed how you see everything." It was the perfect response, acknowledging the gravity without sensationalizing it. We've been on 3 lunches since, conversations that meander from work to travel to terrible movies. It's pleasant. It's undramatic. It feels possible. I close my laptop and look around my quiet apartment. The city lights glitter beyond the windows. The silence is full, not empty. I think of the woman I was 2 years ago, sipping wine in her penthouse, so confident in her philosophical high ground, watching the approach of a storm she believed was only a test for her husband. She was arrogant and naive, but she was also brave in her own misguided way. I don't miss her, but I understand her. Her failure was not in believing in trust, but in believing it was a passive state, a philosophy to be professed rather than a dynamic, living thing that requires constant attention and, sometimes, fierce protection. The trust I have now is different. It's quieter. It's trust in my own judgment, hard-earned and regularly checked. It's trust in the small, consistent kindnesses of my mother and my friend Mia. It's a tentative trust in new people, offered in small increments, watched carefully, and withdrawn if the foundations prove unsound. It is not a grand declaration, but a daily practice. The story of the husband, the neighbor, the con, and the collapse, it's over. It has been filed away, a closed case. What remains is not the wreckage, but the clearing it created. And in this clearing, I am building a life, not on a philosophy of trust, but on its messy, complicated, beautiful practice. The quiet after the storm has become a landscape I now inhabit, not with trepidation, but with a sense of earned familiarity. There are no more sudden revelations, no more shocking phone calls from detectives. The narrative arc of betrayal and recovery has smoothed into the flat line of daily living. I go to work, I meet friends, I call my mother, I occasionally see David. The drama has been replaced by the mundane, and I find a deep, surprising gratitude for it. My work continues to evolve. The cases I'm assigned now are complex, often high stakes, but they lack the frantic, proving myself energy of the past. My reputation is no longer the attorney who was breached, but gradually shifting toward the attorney who understands risk. I've begun consulting with the firm's security team, helping to design training modules on social engineering and physical document security for attorneys who work from home. It's strange, turning my greatest professional failure into a specialized skill set, but it feels like alchemy, transforming leaden shame into something of practical value. David and I have settled into a comfortable rhythm. We see each other once a week, sometimes for a long dinner, sometimes for a walk in the park. There is an ease between us, a lack of performative urgency. He is divorced amicably with 2 children in college. His life is full with his own career, his own friends, his own history. We are 2 complete people choosing to spend time together, not 2 halves searching for completion. He knows the full story of Madison and Kyle now, not just the summary. He listened one evening over a bottle of wine, his hand resting calmly on the table between us, his expression one of focused empathy, not voyeuristic shock. When I finished, he didn't offer platitudes or advice. He simply said, "Thank you for telling me. That sounds like it changed the architecture of your life." The metaphor, coming from an architect, made me smile. It was accurate. My mother, ever watchful, has approved of David. "He's steady," she pronounced after meeting him briefly. "He looks at you when you talk." In her lexicon, this is high praise. Our Sunday dinners sometimes now include him, and I watch with a quiet joy as he engages her in debates about city planning or the merits of various eggplant parmesan rec. Ipes, the family I have is small, but it is strong and it is mine. I think of Kyle rarely, and when I do, it is with the neutral detachment of remembering a college classmate. I heard through the grapevine that he and his girlfriend moved to the suburbs. The image is so foreign to the life we had envisioned in the penthouse that it barely registers as connected to me. His path diverged from mine in a cataclysmic way, and now we are simply people living in different galaxies. The anger is gone. The hurt has scarred over. What remains is the faint, intellectual understanding that a person I loved profoundly was not the person I believed him to be. It is a fact of my history, not an open wound. One afternoon, while cleaning out a closet in my apartment, I find a small box labeled in my own handwriting, Penthouse. I depacked it in the frantic, numb days after Kyle left, shoving in miscellaneous items that didn't seem to belong to either of us specifically. I sit on the floor and open it. Inside is a tangle of things: a coaster from a restaurant we loved, a broken watch of his I'd meant to get fixed, a novel with a bookmark forever stuck 2/3 of the way through. And at the bottom, a single photograph. It's of us, taken by a stranger on a beach vacation during our first year of marriage. We are squinting into the sun, arms around each other, laughing at something now lost to time. Our faces are bright, unlined by the suspicion and disappointment to come. I hold the photo for a long moment. I don't feel a surge of grief or longing. I feel a gentle, poignant sadness for those two people who had no idea what was coming. They were so sure of their love, so sure of their sophisticated agreement about trust, so blissfully unaware of the Ukrainian supermodel who would one day move in next door. I don't regret that time, but I recognize it as a former country I can never revisit. I put the photo back in the box, close the lid, and place it on a high shelf. It is not something to display, but it is also not something to destroy. It is an artifact, a piece of evidence from a closed case. Later that week, at the firm, I am asked to lead a seminar for new partners on client relationship management in the digital age. As I prepare my notes, I realize my entire presentation is built on the wreckage of my old philosophy. I talk about the illusion of control, about how believing you are too smart to be fooled is the first step toward being fooled. I discuss the importance of verified trust, of small, consistent checks and balances in both professional and personal spheres. I talk about the danger of narratives, of how we fall in love with stories, the story of a perfect marriage, the story of a damsel in distress, and how con artists are, at their core, masterful storytellers. After the seminar, a young partner lingers. "That was incredibly pragmatic," he says. "A bit cynical, maybe? I consider this." "Not cynical," I reply. "Clear-eyed, cynicism assumes the worst in everyone. Clarity just prepares you for the possibility of it so you can still be open to the best." Walking back to my office, I feel a sense of alignment. The person I am in this professional setting, cautious, experienced, insightful about failure, is the same person I am in my personal life. There is no longer a disconnect, no longer a naive philosopher at home and a sharp attorney at work. I am integrated. The lessons were brutal, but they were unifying. That evening, I meet David at a new restaurant. Over dessert, he mentions casually that he's been asked to consult on a project in London for 3 months. "It's a fantastic opportunity," he says, watching my face. "I'd be leaving in the fall." I take a sip of water, feeling the news settle. A year ago, even 6 months ago, this might have triggered a spiral of anxiety, a fear of abandonment, a test of commitment. Now, I feel only a mild, manageable disappointment at the thought of missing our dinners and a genuine happiness for his opportunity. "That's wonderful, David. You should do it." He smiles, a look of relief and something else, respect crossing his face. "We could figure it out. Lots of video calls. I'd be back for holidays." "We'll figure it out," I agree. And I know we will or we won't. But the outcome doesn't feel like a measure of my worth or the ultimate success or failure of us. It feels like a logistical and emotional problem that two reasonable adults can navigate, one way or another. The stakes feel human-sized, not existential. As I walk home alone later, the night air cool on my skin, I realize this is the final, quiet gift of the entire ordeal: proportion. I no longer see every relationship as a potential forever, every mistake as a cataclysm, every test of trust as a world-ending event. Life has revealed itself to be a series of managements, of expectations, of boundaries, of disappointments, and of joys. The grand, sweeping philosophy has been replaced by a simple daily question: is this working for me? Right now, standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the lights in my own apartment window, the answer is yes. The story isn't about a husband who cheated, or a con artist who lied, or a career that almost ended. It's about a woman who learned, painfully, how to build a life that can withstand all of those things. And in the stillness of this ordinary night, that feels like more than enough. It feels like everything. The seasons turned with a gentle, unremarked consistency, the sharp edges of memory softening further into the backdrop of a life that had, against all odds and my own expectations, found a stable and satisfying new form. The frantic energy of recovery had mellowed into a sustained rhythm of living, a pace set not by external dramas or the need to prove something, but by the quiet demands of a career I still loved and a personal world I had curated with deliberate care. My apartment, once a stark symbol of a fresh start, now simply felt like home, its shelves lined with books I had actually read, its kitchen bearing the slight stains and scratches of regular use, its windows offering a framed view of a city I navigated with confidence rather than trepidation. The partnership at the firm, once the gleaming pinnacle of all my ambition, was finally conferred in a conference room ceremony that was brief, polite, and profoundly anticlimactic. I shook hands, accepted the engraved plaque, and felt not a surge of triumphant joy, but a deep, solid sense of arrival, of a debt finally paid to my own past mistakes. The title changed, but my work did not. I continued to handle the complex, sensitive divorces, now with a team of my own junior associates, and I found I took as much satisfaction in guiding their cautious steps as I did in crafting a winning legal strategy. Mia, now a firmly established partner herself, remained my closest ally within those glass walls. Our friendship, forged in the fire of scandal, now settled into the comfortable warmth of shared lunches and knowing glances during long meetings. David did go to London, and we did figure it out, though not in the way either of us might have initially imagined. The video calls were frequent at first, filled with the eager, slightly forced cheer of people trying to bridge an ocean through a screen, but as his project consumed him and my own caseload reached its seasonal peak, they naturally dwindled to weekly check-ins, then to sporadic exchanges of interesting articles and funny anecdotes. There was no dramatic rupture, no painful conversation about drifting apart. It was a gradual, mutual recognition that the connection, while genuine and good, was not robust enough to thrive on transatlantic fuel alone. When he returned for the holidays, we had a lovely, slightly nostalgic dinner, and at the end of it, he placed his hand over mine and said, "I think we make better friends than anything else, don't you?" And I agreed, with a sincerity that surprised me with its lack of ache. We parted with a warm hug, and I felt a fondness for him that was entirely free of need or complication. It was a relationship that had served its purpose, showing me that I could be open and interested without losing myself, that not every connection had to be measured against the template of forever. His presence in my life and his gentle exit felt like a sign of health, a demonstration that my emotional ecosystem was now capable of sustaining growth and weathering natural decay without catastrophe. The past, in its most acute forms, receded into a series of occasional, brief echoes. A mention of Ukraine in a news report might cause my breath to hitch for a half-second. The sight of a man in hiking gear on a Saturday morning could provoke a vague, distant pang. But these were ghost pains, the psychic equivalent of an old injury twinging before a rainstorm, noticeable but devoid of their original, debilitating power. My mother, perceptive as ever, seemed to sense when these moments occurred, often calling or texting with some mundane question about dinner plans precisely when I needed the reminder of the solid, unshakable ground I now stood upon. She never mentioned Kyle or Madison by name anymore, but her protective vigilance had transformed into a steady, supportive presence, a lighthouse whose beam was now a comfort rather than a glare. I learned, through the impersonal filter of a mutual acquaintance's social media, that Kyle and his partner had a child, a daughter. Staring at the small, blurry photo, I felt a complex swirl of emotions. A faint, old sadness for the family we would never have, a genuine wish for his happiness in this new chapter, and above all, a profound relief that I was not in that picture, that my life had taken a different, freer path. The image conjured no jealousy, only a confirmation of the vast distance between the life I had lived and the life I was living. The most profound change, however, was in Tur. Now, a fundamental rewiring of my perception. The philosophy I had clung to so arrogantly, that love meant offering unconditional trust and that demanding proof was a failure of spirit, had been shattered, and in its place, I had slowly, painstakingly assembled a new understanding. I no longer believed trust was a single, monumental gift you bestowed upon someone. I saw it now as a living structure, built daily with small, conscious choices. It was the choice to share a vulnerable thought and observe the response. It was the choice to set a boundary and note whether it was respected. It was the choice to verify, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for the value of what was being shared. This was not a cynical worldview. Cynicism expects betrayal and sees confirmation everywhere. My new perspective was one of mindful engagement. It allowed for deep connection while acknowledging human fallibility, my own included. It made room for forgiveness without demanding foolishness. In my professional life, this manifested as rigorous protocol and clear-eyed client assessments. In my personal life, it meant friendships that were deep but not enmeshed, and a romantic life that was open but discerning. I dated occasionally, meeting men who were interesting and kind, but I felt no desperate rush, no ticking biological or social clock. The panic of being alone had been burned out of me. I had been through the isolation of betrayal and the solitude of recovery, and I had discovered that my own company was not a punishment, but a foundation. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I found myself sorting through a digital archive of old case files, a tedious task I'd put off for years. Scrolling through folders named for clients long since divorced and settlements long since paid, I stumbled upon a subfolder simply labeled M. My finger hovered over the trackpad. Inside were the scanned copies of the police reports, the detectives' emails, the timeline Mia and I had constructed, even a few of the less invasive photos from the Investigator. I had forgotten I'd saved them here, buried among 1,000 other pieces of professional history. For a long moment, I considered deleting the entire folder, a final symbolic purge. But instead, I opened it. I read the cold, clinical language of the police report describing the perpetrator and the victim. I saw my own frantic notes in the margins of the timeline. I looked at the photo of Madison and Kyle on her balcony, his arm around her waist, and felt nothing but a historian's curiosity. This was not my life anymore. It was a case file. I had been both the client and the attorney, both the victim and the investigator. With a clarity that felt like grace, I realized I didn't need to delete it to be free of it. Its presence here, in this digital drawer among so many other closed matters, was proof that it held no special power. I closed the folder, dragged it into the larger archived directory, and continued with my sorting. The rain pattered steadily against the window, a soothing, rhythmic sound. I was here, in my peaceful apartment, my career intact, my heart my own, and the past was exactly where it belonged, filed away, understood, and ultimately irrelevant to the quiet, contented present. The story was not just over. It had been fully integrated, its lessons absorbed, its pain metabolized, leaving behind not scars but strength and a wisdom that was finally, blessedly, quiet.